Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
You know, it's funny, when we use these terms like dictator, we throw them around authoritarian.
Yeah.
It's like they all get lumped together, right?
Right.
But the comparison you brought today, Hitler in Germany, Castro in Cuba, it's kind of like you said, putting things under a magnifying glass.
Yeah.
To see how these regimes actually form, because it's not always some military coup.
Right.
Like bursting through the doors. It's sometimes about working the system from the inside.
Yeah. And it's what I think is so fascinating is that both Hitler and Castro, despite the face value differences in the revolutions, really capitalized on pre-existing anxieties and unrest in order to seize power.
Okay, so let's paint a picture for folks.
Okay.
It's the 1930s. We're in Germany. They're still recovering from World War I. The economy's in shambles thanks to the Great Depression.
Yep.
And the Weimar Republic, their government at the time, is just drowning in instability.
Right. People were desperate for a leader to lead them out of the chaos that they were experiencing, to restore a sense of national pride and order.
And that's where Hitler and the Nazi Party come in. They were very savvy at exploiting this desperation.
Yes.
And using their growing influence in the Reichstag, the German parliament, to kind of chip away at democracy's foundation.
Absolutely.
And this is where things start to take a turn, right?
Yes.
I mean, the Reichstag Fire, February 1933, historians still go back and forth about whether or not the Nazis actually were the ones who started it.
Right.
But talk about seizing an opportunity.
It was a pivotal moment, the Reichstag Fire. Whether or not it was, started by the Nazis or not, it was a gift to them because it allowed them to really crack down on any political opponents and use that chaos and create a sense of order.
It's terrifying how easily they were able to then suspend civil liberties.
Yeah.
The decree for the protection of people and state. I mean, it sounds so, what's the word I'm looking for?
Right.
So benign, and yet it basically handed Hitler the keys to the kingdom.
It really stripped away any due process and allowed him to arrest opponents, silence dissent, and consolidate his power under the guise of protecting people.
Yeah. And then came the Enabling Act.
The Enabling Act, a month later, this is March 1933.
Wow.
Really shows how quickly a democracy can be dismantled from within, because this act allowed Hitler to bypass the Reichstag entirely. He didn't need them to pass laws, even those that contradicted the Weimar Constitution.
It's amazing how quickly it happened, and I'm curious, what was the reaction like? Was everyone just totally on board with Hitler by this point, or was there some dissent brewing under the surface?
That's a great question, and historians debate that to this day. I think it's important to remember that Hitler's rise wasn't instantaneous. It was a very gradual process of consolidating power, silencing opposition, creating this really compelling narrative that a nation who was yearning for stability and strength would really latch on to.
So it's kind of this mix of fear and persuasion and longing for something better all playing a part.
Exactly, and all of that makes it even more important for us to be looking at these events and trying to understand them, to figure out what are the mechanisms at play that would allow somebody like this to rise to power.
Now, switching gears a little bit to Fidel Castro in Cuba.
Okay.
His path to dictatorship was a bit more explosive, shall we say.
It was a very different situation, of course, because you have the Cuban Revolution, which was fueled by this deep resentment towards the Batista regime,
Right.
which was seen as corrupt and beholden to foreign interests. So whereas Hitler kind of manipulated the legal framework to gain power, Castro led a full-blown revolution, promising to create a new Cuba free from imperialism and inequality.
So very different context, very different approaches to seizing power.
Absolutely.
But what's interesting is that both of them, Hitler and Castro, they both understood this power of the narrative, right?
Yes.
Of framing their actions in a way that resonated with the masses, with the people.
They were both masters at tapping into the anxieties, the aspirations of their people, and offering themselves up as the solution, as the only ones who could deliver on the promise of a brighter future. And that's what I think makes it so important to be examining this and thinking about it critically, because we have to be able to question those narratives. We have to understand the tactics that are being used to amass power.
And Castro was good at that, right?
Yeah.
Like really playing that part and selling that image. I mean, we tend to think of him as this iron-fisted dictator, but the reality is he actually shared power at the beginning.
Yeah, when Batista fled Cuba in 1959, Castro didn't immediately just say, "I'm in charge." He set up a provisional government and brought in figures like President Manuel Urrutia and Prime Minister Jose Miro Cardona.
So almost like a coalition at first.
Right.
So was that Castro being strategic, or was he really open to sharing power at that point?
It's probably a little of both. I mean, you got to remember, revolutions are messy things, and he needed to show stability both to the Cuban people and to the rest of the world. So sharing power at first helped him look legit, but it became clear pretty quickly that Castro was the one calling the shots, the one with the real support on the ground.
So how did he go from sharing to being the Castro, the undisputed leader?
One word: land reform.
Okay.
The first agrarian reform law, total game changer.
Land reform? Huh. That sounds kind of tame compared to secret police and rounding people up, how that went over the people.
Well, think about it. Under Batista, Cuba was basically a playground for rich landowners, a lot of them foreign investors.
Right.
Meanwhile, most Cubans were dirt poor living in the countryside.
Right.
Castro's reforms took huge chunks of that land from those wealthy owners and gave it to the peasants. Powerful message, especially for people who'd been ignored for decades.
So he's putting his money where his mouth is, at least at first.
Exactly. It's not just talk. It's about actually making life better for people. And that's how he built up so much support, especially among the rural poor. They saw him as their savior. But, and this is important, we can't forget the dark side of Castro's rule, the tribunals, the executions. That wasn't exactly power to the people.
Right.
It's a real paradox. While he's enacting these popular reforms, he's also tightening his grip on power through some really authoritarian means. Anyone who opposed him, who was seen as an enemy of the revolution, faced a very harsh reality. Batista officials, political rivals, they were often given these very public trials, found guilty, and executed.
Like a 1-2 punch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Win over the people with one hand and silence dissent with the other.
Yeah, in a way, and it makes it really tough to judge a leader like Castro. Were the reforms genuine attempts to create a fairer society, or were they just a way to grab more power? Historians are still debating that.
It reminds us that revolutions, with all their promises, often come at a steep price. And speaking of steep prices, Hitler's use of fear and propaganda was a whole other level.
Oh, absolutely. They both used a mix of persuasion and force, but the balance was very different. From the start, Hitler's regime was built on fear and intimidation. His stormtroopers, the SA, they were like his personal enforcers, silencing any opposition through violence and threats. You'd see them everywhere at rallies, breaking up meetings, just constantly reminding people what would happen if they stepped out of line.
And then there was the propaganda machine. Goebbels, his propaganda minister. He was a master at controlling the media and shaping the narrative, creating this cult of personality around Hitler.
Goebbels was a genius when it came to manipulation. He knew that to control people, you have to control the information they get. Newspapers, radio, films. He used everything to create a reality that served the Nazi agenda.
And Hitler himself, he was mesmerizing on stage, wasn't he? Just look at those rallies, the pure theatrics of it all. It's hard to imagine how anyone could resist that kind of charisma.
He understood the power of spectacle, of appealing to basic emotions. His speeches were crafted to inspire fear, anger, and in the end, complete devotion.
It wasn't just the rallies, though, right? The Nazi propaganda machine. It was everywhere. They targeted everyday Germans, using posters, films, even children's books to spread their message.
Oh, absolutely. They understood that for propaganda to be really effective, it had to be everywhere. It had to seep into every part of life until it was almost invisible because it was so normal.
Which makes you wonder, how do you even fight that? How do you break through that kind of narrative when it's all around you?
That's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But I think recognizing these tactics, understanding how they work to shape what people believe, that's the first step to resisting them.
So knowledge is power, as they say.
Exactly. The more we know about how authoritarianism works, how it starts, how it spreads, how it stays in control, the better we are at spotting it and fighting back against it no matter what form it takes.
Which I think brings us to a really important point. We've been talking about Hitler and Castro, but this stuff, this mix of fear and persuasion and taking advantage of people, it's not just in the history books, is it? It's happening right now all over the world.
And that's exactly why studying these leaders is so important. It's not about dwelling on the past. It's about learning from it, right? Seeing the patterns, the warning signs, those slippery slopes that can lead to tyranny.
So this isn't just a deep dive into history. It's a deep dive into ourselves, too, in a way. A chance to really look at what we believe and how vulnerable we are to these kinds of narratives.
Exactly, because fighting authoritarianism isn't just about getting rid of dictators. It's about building societies that can stand strong against that kind of power. Societies where people think critically, where different opinions are allowed, where easy answers are met with a healthy dose of skepticism.
That's a powerful note to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's remember that fighting for a better world, a fairer world, it's not a one-time thing. It's something we have to keep working at. And it takes being aware, thinking for ourselves, and being willing to challenge anyone who tries to use our fears against us or twist the truth to get what they want.
Well said, and I'd add that it's a fight worth having because what's at stake is too important to ignore.
Couldn't agree more. This has been a real eye-opener. Thanks for walking us through this really complicated and honestly unsettling part of history.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the past might be set in stone, but the future's not written yet. It's up to us to make it better.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.